I have a feeling, a sneaking suspicion, that the life of the average Secretary of the Navy is all champagne and roses most of the time, except right now there may be a little doubt about it. There are people going around saying, where is the peace reward? And I have a friend of mine who has a perverse turn of mind, sense of humor, who runs over to the Pentagon at lunchtime. And he stands there when the admirals are going out to lunch, and he hollers, downsizing, mothballs, decommissioning. He likes to see the admirals flinch. That's only on one hand. On the other hand, and I think a more profound hand, is probably this. Denmark seems to have vetoed what was left of Europe, and now nobody knows what to do about Yugoslavia. There's already talk about NATO moving in, a naval blockade to enforce the embargoes already intact, and you can guess whose navy will at least take part. So it's not an easy life Secretary of the Navy lives, and yet I have a feeling that this gentleman is going to do pretty well. He's been at it 3 years. He started as an enlisted sailor. He's moved, and he's the only one who's ever moved from an enlistee to run the whole Navy. He can fly an airplane, he can run a submarine, and he's done both in action, if not in combat. Does that do? He has another level. He has another level. He went to law school, joined the Judge Advocate General's Department, rose to head the legal office of the Department of Defense, and then, because of his delicate touch with the law, sat upon the right hand of the President of the United States as Deputy Counsel. I give you, with great pleasure, Lawrence Garrett III, Secretary of the Navy, who will speak to you about the role of sea power in post-Cold War national security. Mr. Secretary.
I'm not sure that, can everyone hear me? Okay. I'll just hang on to this thing if I may. Thank you very much, Brad, for that very kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it is a true pleasure for me to be here in Baltimore. Or is it Baltimore? I can't remember how it's pronounced. Coming from Washington. I'm only sorry that I was not able to come up earlier today or sometime this week and sit in that wonderful new stadium that you have that I saw some time ago and watch the Orioles win. But it is a tremendous pleasure and honor for me to be here with you and to address this very distinguished group. As Brad pointed out, these are turning out to be, I think, particularly interesting times for those of us who are putting together America's post-Cold War defense plans. As we speak, this is a constant evolving process, and we've been doing that for some time. For the first time since I was a small child in 1941, the nation, I think, sees a real opportunity to step down from what has been, in effect, a fully mobilized wartime footing, and as a result, the nation's priorities, the nation's interest, its role in the world, and its calculus of power are beginning to reflect the aspirations of a genuinely peacetime era. The challenge before us, now that the Cold War and even the Soviet Union, as we've known it most of our lives, our history, is to strike a rational balance between, on the one hand, the desire, as Brad pointed out, to claim a peace dividend, the clamoring for which I recall started in 1989, to direct more resources toward our very real problems at home, and they are very real. I think all of us here understand that. To attack the budget deficit, and on the other hand, to maintain the vital security of our considerable interest all over a still very dangerous globe. The one thing on which almost everyone can agree in our military establishment is that we can and we should be smaller than we were when there were 2 million Soviet troops poised to sweep across Western Europe through the Fulda Gap. And that's why President Bush is executing one of the, and I say one of the most dramatic reductions in military force structure that this country has seen since 1946, 1947, since the end of World War II. So if I may tonight, let me give you a little idea of what's been going on. Since my line of demarcation is November of 1987, I had become the Undersecretary of the Department of the Navy in August 1987, and the Berlin Wall came down one night in November. But since fiscal year 1985, the total Department of Defense Budget Authority, as we refer to it affectionately, BA, has dropped by 24%. 24%. Now take 24% out of your budget. And that's not what has been proposed. That's not what you read about in the paper. That's what has already been done. The budget I started with is 24%, almost 25% less than we were planning for in 1987, 1988. That is a cut of nearly 1/4 of your country's defense budget in 7 years. And that cut is going to go even deeper, much deeper, over the next 3 to 5 years. By 1996, ladies and gentlemen, the proportion of the federal budget that we spend on defense will be under 18%, the lowest it's been in over 1/2 a century. And a fraction, a mere fraction of the 57% that we as a nation spent on defense in the early 1950s. Our defense spending will represent about 3.5%, 3.5 cents on the dollar of our gross national product. And that's lower than it's been since the 1930s. About the same proportion of income to this nation that you and I and most people around this country spend on insurance for ourselves in a year. Now I submit, and I know that there are those who will challenge me, but I submit that there are very few government agencies that are offering that kind of rebate to the American people. Not only are we getting smaller, but our strategy is shifting away from constant readiness for global war, as I mentioned earlier, a posture in which we've been virtually since 1945, and towards a posture that will allow us as a nation to respond to regional crises. And I think we all know what those are. We've done that several times since 1945. One difference today, you find governments out there with highly sophisticated weapons proliferating throughout the world, and your Navy understands that because we lost 37 young men on the USS Stark to a highly sophisticated anti-ship missile. In concrete terms, all of this has meant that already in the Department of the Navy and the Department of, well, let me say the Department of Defense, we have canceled over 100 weapons systems programs that have been terminated by Secretary Cheney, secretaries of the military services. Over 155,000 men and women have left the ranks of the armed forces since 1989. Over 400 military bases worldwide are either being closed or have been recommended for closure. And it is meant for us in the Navy and the Marine Corps that the fleet has been reduced by a total of nearly 70 battle-ready ships, battle force ships, and 3,000 Marines in just the last 2 years, the last 24 months. 70 ships out of the inventory, 3,000 Marines. Ladies and gentlemen, your Navy is retiring on average 3 ships every 2 weeks as we meet. It has meant, in short, that President Bush and the Department of Defense have been taking advantage already of a tremendous and exciting historical opportunity to reduce the amount of money that this nation must spend on its ability to fight. But there is a risk in all of these changes, a significant risk, I submit, about which all Americans should be aware. The risk is that the nation's defense force will not be downsized and restructured into a lean, capable, and relevant force for this new world as it evolves. That the blueprint that Secretary Cheney has referred to, that General Powell has referred to, that we have carefully drawn for a properly sized and properly supported armed force will be swept off the table by narrow, narrow political interests. That our military, your military, will be gutted for no reason other than to produce visible short-term savings without any regard for long-term effects. Instead of sticking to a rational long-range plan for creating a smaller military that works, the country could, if it's not careful, end up with a shadow military, which, like the one that existed before World War II, one that I suppose many of you remember, trains with broomsticks instead of rifles. Indeed, Secretary of Defense Cheney has made this point over and over and over again. Since World War I, 1918, as I recall, every time we as a people, and we are not a warlike people, every time we have made major reductions to our defense forces, we have fouled it up. And we've had a number of opportunities. We have been driven by political demands on near-term budgets and not by the long-term foreseeable requirements of national defense. It might be easy, ladies and gentlemen, to shrug off that historical fact if it weren't for the crushing, crushing price that we as a people have had to pay more than once for that lack of foresight, and we're not dumb. 54,000 American lives in World War I, 292,000 lives in World War II, 34,000 in Korea. Americans, despite their traditional inclination to let the rest of the world go its own way, needs to recognize that Sarajevo or a Munich is far less likely to result in a world war if the power and integrity of this nation, the United States, is visibly and actively committed to upholding the peace. What does all this mean for your Navy as we look out into the future, your Navy and your Marine Corps? It means, first of all, that we have to do for you what we do best. Navy and Marine Corps battle groups are constantly forward deployed on a combat footing at the outermost reaches of America's interest. And as Brad pointed out, the world is changing, but the requirements on your Navy and Marine Corps are increasing. Let me give you an example. In August of 1990, as I sat in my office, I had no requirement as your secretary to provide men and women and ships and aircraft for the North Arabian Sea. We had no requirement. Well, that war is history, and your sons and daughters, or the sons and daughters of your neighbors, are now in the North Arabian Sea. And they've been there. And they're there constantly. The Independence Battle Group just relieved the America Battle Group. The America Battle Group is en route home after being deployed away from their families for over 6 months. And ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't checked the newspaper lately, think about the fact that your Navy and your Coast Guard are still enforcing the embargo. The UN sanctions are still being enforced by your Navy and the Navy of some of our friends and allies. And that requirement has not yet gone away either. They are there. As we meet tonight, they are there, and they are trained, and they are ready to respond to crises virtually anywhere in this world, as they have over 200 times since World War II, including Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. They are mobile. Your naval forces are mobile. They are self-contained. They are equipped to project power or wage sustained combat, if that's what the National Command Authority asks them to do. And I always marvel at it, because I go aboard a ship today, and if you have the opportunity, I recommend you do so. You go aboard a nuclear-powered submarine. The average age of that crew is 20 years old. 20. And they provide quite a service for 250 million American people. I think, frankly, they are the most cost-effective, the most effective forces this nation possesses for managing crisis below, and there will be many, or above, or across the threshold of war. Ships, ladies and gentlemen, which are very hard to build, take a long time and a lot of money. Especially modern ships, filled with your Marines, aircraft and missiles, can exert without firing a shot a powerful, stabilizing influence simply by being visible and being on the spot. Think of Achille Laurel. Think of the Gulf of Sidra, when Mr. Gaddafi decided we could not sail in international waters. Without setting foot on foreign soil, without flying over foreign territory, without firing a shot, visible and imposing naval and Marine Corps forces can reassure our friends, as we do and as we are doing tonight, caution, caution potential enemies, and if necessary, punish aggression. Those young men and women routinely and continuously perform an entire spectrum of diplomatic and military missions, from making symbolic port visits to providing disaster relief. An example came up: there's a terrible drought in the Pacific. There's a little tiny island called Chuck. Your Navy and Marine Corps is now in the island of Chuck making water for a desperate population, albeit small. We exercise with allied navies, and we are also very, very much involved in the arrestment of drugs coming into this country. During the 9 months of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the Navy and Marine Corps, your Navy and Marine Corps, were involved not in just 1 or 2 operations, but 5 separate operations during that period of time. We were involved in Liberia. Your sailors and Marines pulled out over 2,000 human beings who were in danger of losing their lives. We were involved in Somalia, where we rescued people who were in danger of losing their lives. While we were engaged in, we diverted assets from the Persian Gulf to Somalia to rescue people out of our embassy. In Bangladesh, you recall, in southern Turkey, and of course in Iraq and Kuwait. Maintaining this capability, ladies and gentlemen, to stay engaged, to keep the peace, to deter conflicts, as well as to fight and win, for we should not fight unless we intend to win, are the principal objectives of the Navy and the Marine Corps, your Navy and Marine Corps, for this era that we are entering and well into the next century. They are, in fact, the objectives of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and all of us, all service secretaries, and those who lead the individual services have set. Those are the goals that we have set for America's overall military policy. The steep, very steep decline in military spending that we have proposed over the next several years is one that still preserves the quality, the technological edge, and the forward presence of your military forces. It's also a plan that takes into consideration the fact that military capability, as many of you know, is not, simply not created overnight. When those ships are gone, we are going to have a very difficult time replacing them. An example, the Tomahawk cruise missile, about which you read, I'm sure, and heard so much, was used for the first time in combat in Operation Desert Storm. But the first flight of the Tomahawk missile occurred in 1976. The F-18s, the Hornet, that flew so many of the Navy and Marine Corps strike missions, hit the drawing boards. This is 1992. It hit the drawing boards in 1974. And the Navy officers, the naval officers, the Marine Corps officers who led the battle groups, operated in the desert, trained for those roles for over 20 years. Let's look in another direction on the timeline. In 1995, if our Congress will support us, we plan to begin building a new aircraft carrier. It's now in the budget. But if we are successful, if the American people will support us in our plans to build this aircraft carrier, we start in 1995. It will enter the fleet in 2003, 8 years later. And it will still be in service when my infant grandson, and maybe your infant grandsons, will approach retirement age. We plan to replace, you may have read about what we call the venerable A6, with a new airplane that we call the AX. Well, the AX hasn't been designed yet, and it won't be operational if we are successful in designing and producing the aircraft until the year 2005. If we put that program off much longer, we may at some point in the not-so-distant future find ourselves with virtually nothing in our inventory that can duplicate the thousands of missions that were flown by this aging A6 aircraft, flown by very, very young pilots. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an anecdotal story. I was talking to a young pilot, naval pilot, flying an aircraft with a bureau number. We refer to our aircraft by bureau numbers. He was flying the very same aircraft, the very same bureau number aircraft that his father flew in Vietnam. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is not that we need as a nation to maintain the enormous military-industrial complex that helped us and helped the world win the Cold War. Quite the contrary. We won that war. And we should enjoy the respite that victory gives us from the need to invest so many billions as we have in the past in our defense. My point, rather, is that we need to maintain, even in a world that has become, in the eyes of many, much less threatening, a sensible margin of military security, a margin that can keep the peace without us having to fight once again. But how do we do that? With all of our problems that beset us, how do we do that? From my vantage point as your secretary, the first thing we do is we take care of the outstanding young men and women who now voluntarily serve in your Navy and Marine Corps and all of our services. Those are the ones that you saw on CNN out there winning the war against Iraq, and many of whom, incidentally, as I pointed out, are still out there. They've come home, they've gone back. We do it as well by focusing our investment dollars on technologies, industries, and research and development projects that give us, as a military service, the greatest marginal benefit. We in the Pentagon won't be spending nearly the amount of money we once spent producing multiple weapon systems and exotic technologies, but we will be investing carefully in the industries and in the technologies that provide what we need at a price that America can afford and with the quality that our servicemen and our servicewomen absolutely must have. Finally, we do it carefully by carefully investing in an infrastructure, and we have a large infrastructure that will meet our needs as we downsize. We are not supporting a Navy that you remember coming out of World War II or even Korea. And we must support that infrastructure in a cost-effective way. We simply cannot, neither the Navy, the Marine Corps, or the other services, afford to continue to support a network of bases, shipyards, repair depots, laboratories that were designed for a Navy much, much larger than the Navy you will have in the 90s. And that's very difficult to do. I'll tell you a story about a shipyard. I was sitting in my office one day and we were debating, a list had been made public about closing shipyards. Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a possibility. Long Beach Naval Shipyard was a possibility. And one of my staff members came running in the office with his hair on fire and said, Mr. Secretary, have you seen this press announcement from OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense? And I said, no, what does it say? And it says, well, the Secretary of Defense today announced the closure of Long Beach Naval Shipyard on June 6th. Well, this is April. I said, well, this is April. I can't close that shipyard by June. Let me see that. And I reached out and I pulled the paper from his hand and I read it aloud. And sure enough, it was a press announcement. It said that the Secretary of Defense today announced the closure of Long Beach Naval Shipyard, effective June 6th, 1950. And I looked at my staff and I said, my God, this has been going on for 40 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to stop here and devote the rest of the time this evening, if I may, to responding to your questions and your comments. But before I open up the floor, I very much want to thank you again for coming tonight, giving me the opportunity to meet with you and talk to you about what is going on in your Department of the Navy with your men and women who are protecting your interest and the interest of all Americans all over the world. Thank you very, very much.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. The floor will be open until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, sir, at the microphone.
I wonder if I could take the liberty of asking two questions. First, in light of all the testimony that came out in the Colonel North hearings and Iran-Contra and so forth, hypothetically, if you were ordered by the President to do something that you considered engaging naval forces that was illegal in light of various congressional policies or laws, what position would you take and how would you handle that? And I guess
And you want to follow up?
And a second question, which is I'm sure equally as easy to respond to, is could you explain what the current policy and rationale is on the treatment of homosexuals in the military?
Well, let me take your first question, and then I'll follow up with your second question. Would you repeat the question, please?
The first question is, would you violate the will of Congress if the President asked you to? And the second question was, please explain the Navy's policy on homosexuals.
The first question, you have to understand that as a human being and as an officer appointed by the President, the advice and consent of the Senate, I am sworn to uphold the law. And I am trained in the law, and if in fact I believe that an order has been given me which is unlawful, I have two choices. I can either support the President of the United States or I can resign. And I think I've made my position clear. I have an obligation to you and to all Americans to support the law. We are a nation of laws, not of men. And that's my position. Now, the second question. What is my position? My position is on homosexuals in the military. My position personally is not, in my view, relevant. The Secretary of Defense has taken a position that homosexuality and service in the military is incompatible and is contrary to good order and discipline. I support that position, or I can resign. But let me get into that just a bit. I don't think the American people appreciate, for example, and I support General Powell's position. He has articulated it, I think, in a way that is easily understood. And let me tell you about going to sea in ships. One of the things that you put up with when you go to sea is months and months of loss of privacy and the loss of everything else that most Americans are used to. Americans don't appreciate that your young men and women, for we have almost 9,000 women at sea in your Navy ships, are afforded less living space than is required to be provided for a federal prisoner in a federal penitentiary. Now, we all know what goes on in penitentiaries. So my view is that our young men and women, they are not your age, they're not my age, their judgment has not necessarily matured. They don't understand many of the issues that surround, this very volatile issue. And until we find ourselves in a position such that they can be understood, and then it will not add to good order and discipline to force that lifestyle upon those who not only don't like it, but don't understand it. And I don't question, nor will I ever, the patriotic nature of those whose sexual orientation is different than heterosexuals. And that's why I don't believe it should be done.
Yes, sir.
I also have two questions, Mr. Secretary. I'm convinced with the long term needed to produce weapons from the drawing board and ships until they are active. But we do have the whole mothballing system. Therefore, how long does it take to get a mothballed carrier or battleship back to battle-ready condition? And along with that, we have to respond to regional, global hotspots, transport some troops. And I was rather disappointed that nothing has been done to rescue the SS America, which is the fastest moving liner we've ever had. So one has to do with this whole mothballing operation. The other question is a strategic nature, and that is I was sad and thought it was a mistake that we had to move out of the Philippines as a key base out there. But then when I heard apparently we're going to Singapore, that's probably far more strategic spot. Would you comment on those two things?
Well, it varies. The question, would you like to repeat the question, Doug?
The first question is, would you comment upon the process of mothballing as a way of dealing with logistical problems if additional forces were needed beyond those that are at ready? And the second question was, does Singapore serve as an adequate substitute or alternate for Subic and the other bases in the Philippines which we've lost?
Thank you very much. First question, it depends on the ship and how you layer up. And I'm not an expert, but I mean, you can either fill it full of cosmoline and layer up and hope that you don't have to use her again, or you can do what we've done many, many times, which is to overhaul the ship, our partial overhaul, to get her ready and then put her in Cosmoline. One will cost you $30 million, the other will cost you $300 million. And you can guess where we're going in most instances at this point in time. We have laid up the battleships, for example, and we have preserved them in a way that if necessary, we could probably get them back online within 6 months. And the real driver are people, getting trained crews to operate safely and effectively. But those are very valuable assets. Ladies and gentlemen, you may not have thought about it, but if you wanted to ask your president or your national command authority to build you a battleship today in the United States of America, you could not do it. The USS Wisconsin was built in 1944. I was 5 years old. If we wanted to build the Wisconsin today, we could not build it. We do not have the industrial facilities to roll the steel. And that's why those 4 ships, in my view, are important. An aircraft carrier obviously costs a little bit more. Again, it's people. An aircraft carrier, by its lonesome, takes about 5,000 men to man. Put the air wing on board, it's about 6,000. And we will be putting our carriers, some of our carriers, in mothballs. So we are looking at that. I mean, one of the president's pillars, his pillars that he announced in Aspen in August of 1990 is reconstitution. We will reconstitute a large number of ships by pulling them out of mothballs. But you must remember, between 1969 and 1973, your Navy took out of commission over 800 ships, most of which are no longer in existence. So it's important that we do that, and we are doing that. The second issue...
Will you comment on the SS America before you leave that as a possible mothball?
I was trying to avoid that.
Okay.
The issue with the America, and I looked at it, personally looked at it during the time that we were building up in the desert. And I must tell you that when you compare the cost of refurbishing, you mean the America or the SS United States?
On the United States, I beg your pardon.
And I have a very, very close fondness for that, for as a small child, I watched her slide down the ways as she was commissioned. But the millions of dollars, actually I should tell you the hundreds of millions of dollars, that it would have cost to refurbish the SS United States and turn her into a troop ship was, on the basis of a very simple economic analysis, overcome quickly by the amounts of people that we could take to that part of the world or any part of the world by air. And it was just not cost effective to do. Now, can I go on to Singapore?
Please.
I am very pleased that the government of Singapore has given us the opportunity to find this waypost or way station in the middle of the Pacific, for it is a very, very large part of the world, as you all know. And we will, as a Navy and Marine Corps, continue to operate in that part of the world. The loss of Subic, I regret, because the ship repair facility there was very, very important to our ability to operate without the difficulty that we are going to encounter in the future without having that facility. And also, one of the most important things about the Philippines was the fact that we had training ranges for our aviators, our friends and allies who use these training ranges to hone themselves right up to the edge as they deployed into that part of the world. And I must tell you, every time our people deploy, they deploy into the unknown. They don't know when they weigh anchor in Norfolk what awaits them. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. So it's important to me that we have that way station. I visited Singapore recently. The people of Singapore, the government of Singapore are supporting us magnificently. It is nowhere, I mean, we're not going to have the same degree of capability there that we had in the Philippines, but the work that will be done aboard our ships is of the highest quality. The captains I have talked to have had work done there are very, very pleased. And the housing, the quality of life of our people will be very good. So I think it will work out very well.
I must tell you that I was really impressed with your discussion.
Well, thank you.
But I need to ask a question. Is it possible, in your opinion, that we could reduce the continuing need for our military expenditure by truly controlling our export of militarily oriented equipment and technology? Is my perception correct that in Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield, we were receiving the receiving end of our own technology?
I think you're incorrect as it relates to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. That does not mean we were not on the receiving end of technologies that are exported around the world by some of our friends and allies. This is a phenomena that exists, and I think certainly has always existed. We are exceedingly careful within the Pentagon in the decisions that we make regarding technology as to whether or not it will or will not be exported, to the extent that we are not highly thought of by some who would like to export it, because it does make a tremendous difference. Let me give you an example. The Finnish government just made a decision, as you probably know, to purchase F-18s, made by McDonnell Douglas, Northrop, General Electric, and that generates a lot of jobs. Now, we have sold F-18s to the Australians, our friends. We have sold them to the Canadians. We have sold them to the Kuwaitis at this point in time. Every one of those airplanes that are sold reduces the cost to the American taxpayer of an airplane that your Navy flies or your Marine Corps flies. The unit cost comes down. The real issue is, to whom do you sell them? You'll recall we sold F-14s to the Iranians in the late 70s. Had the Iranians fought us? Yes, we may very well have met that airframe in the air, over the desert, or over the water. But let me assure you that had that happened, we'd have cleaned their clock. They would not have had a chance. That's an old saying that we'd have wiped them slick, let me put it that way, because of our people, our training, our tactics, and the technology that we have. So I want to assure you that the decisions that are made in every instance, when we decide whether or not to export a technology, to the chagrin, as I say, of some, it is looked at very, very carefully before a decision is made to do that. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, at the microphone.
Thank you. Sir, two questions.
Yes, sir.
One on naval aviation and one on the submarine fleet, if I could. The first one on naval aviation. You read a lot in the press about different platforms under debate, such as one you referred to, the AX to replace the A6, and the F and A-18, and continuing it and upgrading it, and the F-14. Could you generalize for us where the priorities for naval aviation are? What gets to priorities right now? And my second question, the submarine fleet, is also, you read about a lot in the press about the proposed submarine, the Seawolf, that was to be built and then recently canceled, and that seems to have generated a lot of political and job debates each ways. And I was just wondering, is that still a political hot potato, or is that dead?
I sometimes feel like when I go to work, I'm walking over a bed of hot coals, hot potatoes. The issue on the airplanes are right now we have 3 tactical airplanes in our fleet on your carriers. The A6, which, as I said, was introduced into the fleet before the handheld computer was developed. I mean, the little handheld calculator. I mean, that's the kind of technology that your young men are flying out there. The F-18 and the F-14. The A-6B is a version of the A-6. The priority in the Navy today is tactical naval aviation in a package. The the AX to replace the A-6, and the the F-18E and F to replace the F-14 and the F-18C and D. So after the turn of the century, the young naval aviators will be flying two airplanes, primarily two tactical airframes off of the decks of our carriers, the 18E and F and the AX. That's the priority. As to the submarine, we're still building the current submarines that are operating throughout the world, the the 688 and the approved 688. We have not yet built that class. We have not yet completed building the class of Tridents as part of our strategic deterrent. And the Seawolf was canceled primarily because the Seawolf was a weapons platform designed to counter Soviet-designed platforms that we anticipated would be coming out in the early and the late 90s. That's not going to happen. I feel rather sure of that. And so there was no need, really, to expend $2 billion per copy on the world's first-rate submarine. We will build two of those, it appears, if the President signs the rescission package that was just acted on by Congress. And then we must design a cheaper submarine if this nation is to retain a submarine force after the year 2020. And that's what we will be doing. That's what we're doing today, trying to develop a cheaper, smaller submarine. But I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that by the year 2009 or 2000, that I don't know how we're going to define cheap. But you have, I don't want you to leave here tonight without understanding that you have the finest submarine navy in the world, bar none. There is no one out there that can match them because of their technology, because of their training, and because of the people. Again, think, a nuclear reactor moving along at a rather deep depth at a rather high rate of speed in the hands of 19-year-old Americans. It is really phenomenal, especially when you do it under the North Pole. You have a Navy and a Marine Corps comprised of your sons and daughters about which you can be extremely proud and thankful for. And you've got to take care of them. You've got to support them. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, now, why, when we are the world's only remaining superpower, do we need a submarine force second to none?
Well, I get that question frequently. First of all, we've got it. I submit that it's folly to throw it away. Secondly, the Soviets are still building submarines for export, diesels. There are 45 nations who have submarines. Now let's take the scenario from August of 1990 until January of 1991. Your Navy received a great deal of criticism because of its lack of sea lift, something that was alluded to a little earlier. And yet, your Navy moved more equipment and fuel oil further, faster than we ever have in the world, in history that I know of. Let me finish. Now, this all traveled across the Atlantic, and some remember 1942. It's called the Battle of the Atlantic. We almost lost it to diesel submarines through the Mediterranean, down through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, through the North Arabian Sea, and up into the Persian Gulf. One submarine sitting off the Strait of Hormuz, and your Iranian friends are in the process of acquiring 3, could have changed that whole equation. And we need submarines to take them out on occasion. And that's why I think that whole equation could have changed. Plug up the Suez Canal. Plug up the mouth of the Red Sea. Take out one 900-foot merchantman carrying unit equipment to supply a Marine Expeditionary Force and ask the American people to pay for it and explain it by saying, we don't have a submarine force. Not on my watch. I think we need it. The world is, until we see that equation change, and I don't see it changing, in a positive way, except for the fact that the Soviet Navy is not building 10 submarines a year. But you have to remember that that capability is there too. They completely refurbished their submarine navy in the decade of the 80s. Over 100 submarines were built and are in operation. Capability is out there. Political will is not there. Hopefully it will not return. So I think that's why we need a submarine navy second to none. Yes, sir.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not here to ask a question, but simply to reinforce your position. I have lived through 3 downgradings of the Navy and saw the results of it in each occasion. And this is the second time that I've been present for a delivery by the Secretary of the Navy. I enjoy this. The first time it was disaster. And I just want to say...
Tonight?
Not tonight.
Oh.
The first time. First time.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood
First time
you.
was a naval base at Norfolk in 1949. We had laid the keel to the Forrestal, and it was well underway. At that time, we had a businessman. I won't mention his name. I wanted to forget it. Who was then Secretary of the Navy, and I was down there on my 2 weeks training duty. And the commanding officer of the base and the air station conscripted everybody present to come to the O Club for the big conference with the then secretary. I never saw so many cars with pennants with stars on in my life. But the end result was, in that summer of '49, he left the message at Norfolk, we're scratching the Forrestal. And as you all know, it was just a couple months later that Korea commenced. We did build the Forrestal, but we were late. And that fortifies with me the statements you've made tonight at what we have to anticipate and what we have to do in the future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. If I can make a point, the USS Forrestal, we deployed for the last time in an operational mode in September, I'm sorry, I think it was March of 1991. That ship that the keel was laid in 1949 is still sailing in Pensacola as a training carrier. But even more important was the Midway. Midway was laid down in 1944, I think, during the Second World War. She never made it. She was commissioned on the 10th, I think the 10th of September, and never got into the war. Of course, she subsequently fought in Korea, in Vietnam, and in Desert Storm. When we retired her in April, she was almost as old as I am. And it was a phenomenal thing to sit on that ship and watch her decrew and look out at the former commanding officers who were present. There weren't as many as the people in this room, but I can tell you there was a long, long line of commanding officers. I have a little anecdotal story I tell every now and then about the investment that the American people make in their Navy. In 1952, you, your parents, invested in a ship called the USS Saratoga. The USS Saratoga is now deployed en route to the Mediterranean. 40 years later, in 1952, we built an Air Force base in Libya. We don't operate that anymore. But we still get our return from our investment in the USS Saratoga. Anecdotal, yes. True nonetheless. That's the beauty of your naval forces. You send them, they appear over the horizon. It's Teddy Roosevelt's big stick. We speak softly, but we've got the big stick. And it's absolutely vital, I think, that you understand and that all of the people of this country understand, for there are 250 million of them today, many of them who don't remember the sacrifice that you made or that those of your generation made to give us what we have today, when we had a much larger Navy. And if we don't maintain our capability to influence events in this world, we are inviting, maybe even asking, to repeat those mistakes that Secretary Cheney has referred to. Sacrifice, yes. I like to think of it as an umbrella of security under which 250 million Americans conduct their daily lives, you know, the good, the bad, the ugly. Take away the umbrella. Ladies and gentlemen, it's going to rain. In your lifetime and in mine, it's going to rain. Now, we can give it up. We've done it before. I don't recommend it. Not at all. And we owe it, as American citizens, to those 19-year-old sailors and Marines and airmen and soldiers, to not put them in harm's way, as we did in 1940 and 41, 1950, and 1965. And we did it right in 1990, 1991. And let's try and ensure that their children are not asked 20 years from now to go in harm's way the way we sent them before.
If you give us the opportunity, Mr. Secretary, we'll probably impose on your time more than we should. We've promised you that we would end our session somewhat close to 10 minutes after 7, and in a flexible keeping with that promise, let me, on behalf of the audience, thank you for what I think has been extraordinarily informative but also an enjoyable evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.